Hello, I'm Janet Ayers, and in this session we're going to talk about the evolution of leadership. I love history, and this is one of the things that just fascinates me about how the thinking of leadership has changed over time. And during my 4 decades of working in this area, it's been very interesting to me to see how the concepts have changed and how the language has changed, as well as how we practice and work to try to understand what leadership is about. So this is a rather long presentation, but I feel some of the concepts help us today to better understand what leadership is about. So the reason for doing this is to present an evolution of the research, and this is research-based, and at the end I'll give you a couple of textbooks that I've used in my class that help to really show there really is a rich background and research basis in leadership. And I'm going to start off with the concept of leadership itself, which goes back into the early 1800s, which was first used in England and referred to people that served in Parliament. And at that time, it was a very elitist concept of thinking that you were born into a great family, a great man, very literally. Women were not a part of this at that time. And a lot of assumptions that you were born a leader. And so there were a lot of Darwinistic principles around the thought of leadership, and that they have these natural abilities of power and influence over others. Well, the thing is, this didn't hold up in research. So this perspective of leadership did change because the research really has not supported it. And it's a very limited elitist view of leadership, which in today's reality, we don't give much thought to this. So this evolved then to what was known as the trait theory, and there were a number of studies that were done in the 1920s, 1950s, that had some assumptions that a leader had a superior or endowed qualities, again sort of the hangover from the great man theory, and that certain individuals possessed by their personality the ability to lead. So it's that are leaders born or are leaders made? Well, the trait theory really believes that leaders were born into leadership. And this was during a time when psychology was an emerging field, and so a lot of the research at that time was in the field of psychology. So in 1948, a very, very thick book that I use as a doorstop was done by Bass and Stodgill about characteristics of leaders. But you know what I find interesting? When I do workshops on leadership and I ask people how they think about leadership, still come up with these characteristics and these traits of people that they want to follow. So trait theory is still around, and it's still a part of our thinking about leadership. But there were some major criticisms of this set of research and this theory around leadership, saying that, well, it's not taking into consideration the situation. And leadership is contextual. You have to consider the situation that people find themselves in order to really understand leadership. Also, really measuring the traits of an individual is a very, very hard thing to do. So the trait theory was really replaced by, let's take a look at what it is leaders do, their behavior. Well, before this behavioral theory really got underway, Kurt Lewin from the University of Iowa made a major contribution back in the 1930s and used a couple of words that we still use today in terms of an autocratic leader and a democratic leader. So these concepts were picked up by others, and during the 1950s and 60s, a whole set of research that was done about what it is that leaders do. And it made some major assumptions that there's a best way to lead. In other words, this is where you hear the terminology leadership style. And a lot of assessments to determine your leadership style. And it was concerned with sort of two things. One is getting the job done, the task, the goals, what you're trying to achieve, as well as being able to work effectively with people. So it was an interesting theory, and a lot of interesting studies came out of this. Some of this still is around today. Two of the major places where this research was taking place was at Ohio State and University of Michigan. And there was a very popular questionnaire called the LBDG, the Leader Behavior Description Questionnaire, that you could take, and it would tell you your style of leadership. And it really took into consideration two broad categories of what a leader does. Again, this is around the behavior and how a leader performs. So it's to the extent that a leader is sensitive to subordinates. Again, a word that was used back during the 1950s in that time period. And then to the extent that the leader was oriented toward the work and achieving the goals. So building off of this theory, a behavioral theory, was McGregor's X and Y. This was a widely known theory in the 1950s that made two assumptions about human behavior and motivation. It's really sort of the first time that motivation was discussed in the literature. So Theory X. And the reason for talking about this now is because I think some of these assumptions about motivation are still around today as we talk about leadership and working in groups. So Theory X said basically a belief that humans are basically ignorant, lazy, apathetic, and irresponsible. Ooh, ouch. Also that humans disdain work and they try to avoid it. Leaders need to design devices to closely monitor and control people, and the leadership style that is most effective is being autocratic, directive. Well, remember the time period. This is the 1950s, this is after World War II, and the workplace is primarily manufacturing. And that's where these studies were taking place. So again, think of the time period, think of what's going on at that point in time and where this research was being conducted, and it helps to make sense of this. Does it have relevance today? Well, maybe. The other theory was Theory Y, and it was the antithesis of Theory X, that work is as natural as play, and people are willing to work very hard, and they can exercise their own self-control and be directive of themselves and be responsible if they are tied in to the organization's goals and committed to what the organization is trying to achieve. So therefore, leaders need to maximize workers' autonomy and give them responsibility and recognition. In other words, give them freedom to achieve at their highest potential. So it was saying the appropriate leadership style is more democratic. Then Blake and Mouton came along with a managerial grid. So this was still around when I started studying leadership in the 1970s. And again, an assessment that you could take, and it would tell you your leadership style and whether you tended to be more oriented toward the relationships in a group, in other words, that country club manager, or if you tended to be more of the task-oriented manager, and where you fell in this grid. A very popular self-assessment that was done back in the 60s. So these behavioral theories contributed a lot to the knowledge of leadership and how it was thought of at that point in time. Again, we're looking in the 1950s, 1960s. And, but it was also criticized later, saying, well, it's not paying attention to the context that people are working in or the group processes, that leadership is far more than just a leader and, as they called him then, the subordinate, that there's this whole dynamic of a group going on, and it depends upon the situation. So it's not so simple to take an assessment and identify your leadership style. It's far more complex than that. So this moved into what was called contingency theories, or also a little later called situational. And this was the dominant field of research between the 1950s and the 1980s. And it made some assumptions that leaders act differently based on the situation where they find themselves. So as we think about community leadership and the workplace, we might think that being a leader in a community context is going to be very different than being a leader in a workplace. The situation really determines who may emerge as a leader. So the contingency, what does that mean? This was a set of theories really looking at how one thing depends on other things. And as we looked at contingency leadership approaches, it was trying to delineate the characteristics of situations and followers and then determine what the leadership style that would be most effective in that situation. So this gave a whole impetus to a number of views that are still useful in thinking about today as we come to understand leadership and its complexity. So one of the major researchers during this time period was Fred Fiedler, and he was trying to diagnose whether a leader tends to be more task-oriented or more relationship-oriented. That kind of sounds to me like the Myers-Briggs there. And then match the leadership style to the situation. So this set of theories contributed a number of things to the literature. First of all, it was supported by empirical research, and it did show the importance of understanding the context or the situation where people find themselves. And it could prescribe certain leadership styles that were going to be most useful in certain situations. And it also said that individuals or people will not likely be effective in all situations where they find themselves. So one of the major theories during this time period in the 1970s was the path-goal theory. And I find this useful to think about as we think about leadership today, because there's some components to it that, while this doesn't hold up in its entirety, I think there are some things to think about that are still useful today. So it's really thinking about the situation and who's involved and motivation and how a leader, a person in a position of authority, can help people be successful. And 4 leadership styles were identified. So this is a little graphic that shows, given the situation where a follower lacks self-confidence, that the leader needs to be very supportive of that individual, and that's going to help that individual increase their confidence to achieve a work outcome. And the outcome is going to be, not only are they getting the job done, but they're going to be happier in the workplace. Again, most all of these, the research was conducted in the workplace. If the job is ambiguous, then it's saying the leader needs to be a little more directive, in other words, teaching or telling, and that's going to help that subordinate or that follower to know how to do his or her job better. It also talks about how to achieve rewards, if that's a motivator for an individual. And then for some individuals, they really need to have the leader working beside them. And so 4 different styles of leadership in different situations depending upon the individual, but again with the outcome of being job satisfaction and good relationships. So a lot of contributions of this theory. It was very helpful in providing a theoretical framework to understand leadership behaviors, the effect that a leader's behavior has on subordinate satisfaction and their work performance. and it also integrates the concept of motivation and motivation principles into this theory. So there's a lot more to be said about this theory, and is sort of a study in and of itself. By the way, as an aside here, I'm running through this very, very rapidly. In my leadership class, we spent about half a semester just understanding these different theories, so there is a lot to be said about them. Vroom-Yago contingency model also added to this whole area of research, and they had a model that was a little bit different. And what they looked at is how a leader makes decisions, and based upon how much influence they want to have in the situation and how much freedom they give to the group. And the real value of this model, I think, are the questions that I think are still relevant today and useful. So they identified several diagnostic questions, which I'll go over here in just a moment, that help a leader make a decision, and whether the leader decides or whether the leader delegates that decision to others. So a number of questions about how significant is this decision, and if the decision is important, then the leader needs to be involved in making the decision. How important is subordinate commitment to carrying out the decision? Well, if implementation is going to require a high level of commitment, then the subordinates should be involved in that decision-making process. What is the level of the leader's expertise in relation to the problem? And if the leader does not have a high amount of information, knowledge, or expertise, the leader should involve subordinates in obtaining it. If the leader were to make the decision alone, would subordinates have high or low commitment to the decision? And if subordinates typically go along with whatever the leader decides, their involvement in the decision-making process will be less important. And what is the degree of subordinate support for the team's or organization objectives that are at stake in this decision? So if there's low support, the leader should not allow the group to make the decision alone. And the final two sets of questions were, what is the level of group members' knowledge and expertise in relation to the problem? And if subordinates have high level of expertise in relation to the problems, more responsibility for this decision can be delegated to them. And how skilled and committed are group members to working together as a team to solve problems? When subordinates have high skills and desire to work together, then more responsibility for decision making can be delegated. So I think this is a helpful model. These questions, I think, are still relevant for today for people that are serving in positions of authority, and in fact, maybe should be considered in some of our organizations today. Building on this was Hershey Blanchard, very, very popular, and they came out with what was called situational leadership, and there were tapes and books and assessments around this model. So they took this one step forward in terms of looking at followers and their skills and abilities, and then determining sort of 4 styles of leadership that give clues to what a leader can or should do based on the job to be done, the relationship between the leader and the follower, and the follower's readiness to accept these tasks. So without going into a lot of detail, it is still combining motivation, the ability of the leader along with the abilities of the followers, the complexity of the job to be done, and whether the leader is giving direction in what they call telling, teaching, or selling, or which is about influence, or participating with the followers, or totally delegating. So it combines a little bit of motivation, decision making, task, relationship, and all of the previous things that we've talked about. So some strengths of situational leadership: it's very practical, it was straightforward, and one of the things that came out of this is showing leadership is really much more complex than some of the earlier perspectives and bodies of research were thinking about. And leaders need to have a flexibility to adapt to different situations. And I'm going to bring this up to the latest sort of thinking about leadership, which is about authentic leadership or adaptive leadership, which really brings in change. So some of the weaknesses that were shown in this research model is that there really was limited research, however, to really support some of the theoretical underpinnings. So it's interesting that this was very practical and it was put to use in a lot of organizations, but the research really didn't justify some of the labels that were used in the leadership styles. It had some weaknesses from a research base. Well, now we're up to the 1960s and 70s where, think about the time. The 60s in the U.S. was a time of great chaos, the Vietnam War, civil rights. That's a time where I was coming through high school, and I know that a lot of changes, women moving into the workforce, really a very different dynamic was going on in our society. And so there was a search to explain leadership in a different way. And the words transformational leadership was the paradigm. And I'm showing Martin Luther King here because I think he sort of epitomized bringing leaders and followers together for a struggle to accomplish complex goals in a way that in doing that, in that process of having a vision and trying to achieve something great, you move one another to a higher level of morality and motivation. And this is a quote from James McGregor Burns. He was one of the leaders in this theoretical perspective around transformational leadership. So the basic precepts of this theory was really developing followers into leaders, and it's really the first time that that was really one of the major precepts. Much more concerned for followers to reach a higher level of being, and that skills are learned, they are not ingrained in personality characteristics. So this is really a moving away from the traits of leaders. And it's really moving from the goals of a leader and that personality or the traits of a leader to the goals of a group and the dynamics of what's going on within the group itself. It's also the first time where vision starts to play a major role of not only the goal of the group, but that great goal of the group, that vision. Something grand, something meaningful that we aspire to. And it was also the first time that leadership was really seen as, leadership's not about just maintaining order and stability. And they made a distinction between transactional leadership, which was about maintaining order, which has become more known as management, to leadership is something quite different, where it is about change, and it's the first time that really change was brought into the conversation, and recognizing that in that process there's going to be conflict and chaos, and that's okay. It was during this time that a very popular view of leadership, I wouldn't call this a theoretical perspective, but it has been a very popular perspective of looking at being of service. It definitely is a philosophical perspective of an attitude toward leadership, where its basic premise centers around the attitude and behavior of the leader in relationship to the followers and the mission of the organization. 1970, Robert Greenleaf wrote, with his experiences from AT&T as an executive in AT&T for many, many years, wrote about servant leadership and a center for servant leadership located in Indianapolis. And this has become a very popular perspective as people learn how to serve others and be of service to others rather than just of themselves, but in that process they themselves grow. There's 4 basic precepts of servant leadership: of putting service before self-interest, listening first to affirm others, inspiring others by being trustworthy, and nourishing others to help them become whole. The 1980s then saw another major switch in leadership, which sort of built upon all of the theoretical paradigms from the previous generations. But think about what was going on in the 1980s. Those of you who might remember that time period, this is when the internet came into being, and we moved from an industrial society to a post-industrial paradigm, which means we have to think about leadership in very, very different ways. So I could spend a whole hour just talking about this shift, but for purposes here, I just want to say this was a major shift in thinking about leadership and about the workplace in particular, and how we think about how we work with one another in order to reach our goals. And a couple of tables here to show how the language during this time changed. So I think there's another struggle during this time period too that we often don't talk about, is that the language changed. So we talk about teams, and we started to talk about learning. We start to talk about networks and the importance of networks. However, many of our institutions are still structured with policies and procedures that are still of the industrial paradigm. And in our communities, I think this is very important, that our institutional structures sometimes become a barrier to practicing some of the new knowledge, the post-industrial forms of leadership. It takes a very long time to change institutions, particularly ones that are deeply rooted. So this is where I think we get into issues around trust, and a very common cliche we have is walking the talk. So we know the language to use, but it's often very difficult to walk the talk because our institutions are so deeply ingrained in a different paradigm. And hence the challenge to leadership and individuals that hold leadership positions in our institutions. So leadership today, the study of leadership today has evolved to an idea that leadership is a very, very complex concept that reaches far beyond just that of the individual. And Joseph Rost gave a definition of leadership that I'm going to show this in a little more graphic form, that shows the interaction between followers and having shared purpose, a shared goal, a vision, if you will, where they influence one another in the process of achieving that goal. And leadership is very intentional. In other words, it requires a consciousness about what you're doing and the consequences of your action and behaviors on others and on the job that you're trying to do. It's also about personal responsibility and integrity, that inner look at who we are and the consequences of our behavior on others, being trustworthy, many of the things that are discussed in servant leadership. And it is about change. The driver of all of this is the need to be flexible and adaptive and constantly jumping that next wave of change. So personally, I like Rost's definition because I think it captures the dynamics of where we are today. Kouzes and Posner has been a very popular book and series of self-assessments that you can purchase online. And their research was done in the workplace, looking at 5 practices of exemplary leadership, because we want to have a handle on what can we do to be more effective in our positions of leadership and as we work with others, and 5 major precepts of what they focus on, and a very practical way of being able to work with others. Again, I'm not spending time on this, but would lead you to this to read more about it. I wanted to throw in the other concept of followership, because more and more research is being done around followership, and you can't go too far down the road to talk about leadership without also talking about followership. And while we attribute organizational success or failure to the leader, followers are just as important. So looking at this relationship and what can be done to build effectiveness of followership has been a field of research, and Robert Kelly has been one of the leaders of this, and has really focused on the extent to which followers are engaged in the organization or not engaged, the passive versus active, and to the extent that they are independent, critical thinkers, which means part of that is challenging the leadership and leadership being open to that critical thinking and to those challenges, or are they dependent upon the leader to tell them what to do and how to do their job, and not really engaged or critically thinking, and has identified 5 different styles of followership. Interestingly, as you dig into this, there really is not that much difference between followership and leadership. So again, I would lead you to the work of Robert Kelly and a whole field of research and study that you can undertake on your own. I'm going to end this by talking about authentic leadership. And I like that word, authentic. Another word that has been used here is adaptive. In other words, being able to adapt to this situation. Ronald Heifetz, who is one of my favorite authors, writing about leadership, particularly in a public issues context, and I would refer you to any of his work that I think shows the complexity of leadership, particularly as we discuss it in a community context, but talks about 4 different components of authentic leadership, one being self-awareness, and the process by which we constantly are striving to understand ourselves, reflecting on our core values, our emotions, being able to deal with our emotions, our own motives and goals, and to come to grips with who we are and how this insight, how this growth can provide a strong anchor for us as we work with others and influence how we make decisions with others and our actions. And I just feel this is so terribly important in community leadership, to be able to see issues as they are very authentically and not take so much of what may be said personally. So the self-awareness dimension is, I think, a lifelong development arena for us, but it's also critical to be able to work effectively in the public arena. The internalized moral perspective. And this is really coming to terms with what is right and what is wrong, knowing ourselves in a way that we have internalized so that when we are challenged by others, when we listen to people that have very different points of view, we are confident enough in our own beliefs that we don't take things personally, and we know how to sort out the issues from those personal attacks. And then the balanced processing. I like this as a way of knowing how we use our critical thinking skills to really analyze issues, to think them through, to challenge the status quo. not to be critical of others, rather to think through the issue and to be able to process information in a critical perspective, and to be able to explore others' opinions before we make a decision, to not be too rash. And also be able to solicit viewpoints from others, particularly those with whom we may very much disagree in philosophy or perspective, rather than demonizing people who have different points of view. And then the relational transparency, about being open with others, knowing where to share our core feelings in terms of what's relevant to the issue. At the same time, the difference between sharing core feelings and what we may share on Facebook, things that are maybe not all that sensical. So it is about using judgment and coming to a judgment that we feel is relevant, and also being attuned to the motives and inspiration of others, and sharing our thoughts in an open and honest way. Authentic leadership leads to 4 psychological attributes that I think are much needed in today's society. So this is why I wanted to close here, because there's many other models and perspectives that can be discussed. But I would like to end on this in terms of being able to inspire confidence in ourselves and others, of having hope ourselves and being able to inspire that hope, having optimism about the future, and knowing that as we struggle with tough issues in our community, if we work together, we can find solutions to them. And then above all, being resilient, not only as an individual, but as a community. So I would like to summarize here by the reason for showing all of these different leadership perspectives. There is a rich history and research base. Our knowledge about leadership has evolved over time, given the context of our society and the changing nature of that society. History plays an important role, and I do know that leadership is going to continue to evolve into the future. So to me, this is a lifelong quest of understanding how complex it really is. I do believe, and the research shows, leadership is learned and it is developed over a lifetime. And hopefully there's going to be a lot more research about how we can work together more effectively. So I'll share with you 2 of the resources that I like, that I have used in my classes, and I have used largely as a basis for this series of 10 videos. One is by Peter Nordhaus, which is very rich with the theory of leadership, and goes into detail about the different leadership perspectives, and the leadership experience by Richard L. Daft, which is the textbook I have used in my class. So I would lead you to both of these. Again, thank you very much for your participation in this series, and I bid you well in your leadership journey.